In a small, quiet town surrounded by rolling hills and open farmland, life moved at its own gentle pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches swaying softly in the breeze. People knew each other by name, and trust was the glue that held the community together. It was the kind of place where doors were rarely locked and neighbors shared fresh-baked pies over fences. At the heart of this peaceful town lived a man named Hank, a 90-year-old World War II veteran who had spent his life serving others. Hank wasn't just any ordinary senior citizen. He was a walking piece of history. His stories about battles fought decades ago, camaraderie on the battlefield, and the sacrifices made for freedom captivated everyone who listened. Kids from the neighborhood often gathered around him during summer evenings, eager to hear tales of bravery and heroism. Hank's little roadside stand, set up near the edge of his property, became something of a local landmark. Every weekend, he'd sell vegetables grown in his garden, tomatoes still warm from the sun, crisp cucumbers, and fragrant herbs. But it wasn't just the produce that drew people in, it was Hank himself. He had a way of making you feel seen, valued, even if you only stopped by for 5 minutes. For many, those short conversations with Hank felt like therapy, a reminder of simpler times when kindness mattered more than anything else. But one fateful evening, the tranquility of Hank's world came crashing down. A loud rumble echoed through the air as a group of motorcycles approached the outskirts of town. The sound grew louder, menacing until it drowned out the chirping of crickets and rustling leaves. This wasn't the usual friendly roar of weekend bikers passing through. These riders belonged to the Iron Vipers, a notorious gang known for causing trouble wherever they went. The Iron Vipers weren't strangers to violence. Their reputation preceded them. Tales of vandalism, intimidation, and unchecked aggression followed in their wake. When they rolled into towns like this one, fear rippled through the streets. Shopkeepers pulled down their blinds, parents called their kids indoors, and everyone braced themselves for whatever chaos might follow. On this particular night, the gang decided to make Hank's roadside stand their first stop. They parked their bikes in a messy cluster, engines revving as they swaggered toward the elderly man standing behind his humble display of fresh produce. One of the bikers, sporting leather vests covered in patches and tattoos snaking up his arms, stepped forward. His voice was gruff, almost mocking, as he demanded free goods without offering so much as a please. Hank stood his ground, though his frail frame seemed dwarfed by the towering figures before him. With calm dignity, he explained that he relied on selling these vegetables to get by. "Even heroes have bills to pay," he said with a faint smile, trying to lighten the mood, but his attempt at humor fell flat. The leader sneered, clearly unimpressed, and ordered his men to take whatever they wanted. When Hank gently pushed back, refusing to be bullied, the situation escalated quickly. What started as verbal threats turned physical. The bikers surrounded him, shoving him roughly, knocking over his stand, scattering tomatoes and cucumbers across the dirt road. Hank tried to shield himself, but there was no escaping the brutality that followed. Blow after blow landed on his fragile body, leaving him bruised and bleeding. By the time the gang mounted their bikes and sped off into the night, Hank lay, crumpled on the ground, gasping for breath. It didn't take long for word of the attack to spread. Neighbors rushed to Hank's aid, calling an ambulance and gathering what remained of his scattered produce. As news traveled through the town, shock turned to anger and then to fear. Everyone knew the Iron Vipers weren't done. This was just the beginning of their reign of terror. For 3 days, the town simmered with tension. People whispered about what could be done, but no one dared to act. The Iron Vipers were untouchable, or so it seemed. That is, until someone mentioned a name that sent chills down spines and sparked flickers of hope: Chuck Norris. Chuck and Hank went way back, to a time when both men were younger, stronger, and bound by a shared sense of duty. Though years had passed since they last crossed paths, Hank often spoke fondly of his old friend. According to Hank, Chuck wasn't just a skilled fighter, he was a protector, someone who believed in standing up for the underdog. If anyone could face the Iron Vipers and come out on top, it was Chuck. As whispers of Chuck's possible involvement began to circulate, the town held its collective breath. Was it really possible? Could a legend step in to save them from the nightmare unfolding before their eyes? Only time would tell, but for now, the mere thought of Chuck Norris entering the picture gave people something they hadn't felt in days: hope. By the third day after the attack, the town was a powder keg of emotions. Fear lingered in every corner, but beneath it, there was a growing sense of anticipation. The name Chuck Norris had been whispered so many times that it almost felt like he was already there watching over them. For some, it was just wishful thinking, a desperate attempt to hold on to hope in the face of overwhelming odds. But for others, it was more than that. It was belief. Belief that legends don't fade, and when the world needs a hero, they show up. And then, late one evening, something happened that turned whispers into reality. A mechanic who worked at the only garage in town noticed an unusual visitor. The man rolled in on a vintage motorcycle, its chrome gleaming under the dim garage lights. He wore dark sunglasses despite the fading sunlight, a cowboy hat pulled low over his forehead, and boots scuffed from countless miles on the road. There was no mistaking him. Even though he hadn't said a word, his presence commanded attention. The mechanic froze, unsure whether to approach or simply stare in awe. The stranger didn't ask for directions or strike up small talk. Instead, he handed over the keys to his bike with a nod and disappeared into the shadows. When the mechanic finally gathered the courage to inspect the motorcycle closely, he found a license plate bearing two simple words: Lone Rider. That was all the confirmation anyone needed. Chuck Norris was here. Word spread faster than wildfire. By morning, everyone in town knew or thought they knew what had happened. Some claimed they saw him walking through the streets under the cover of darkness, moving silently like a ghost. Others swore they spotted him sitting alone at the diner, drinking black coffee while staring out the window as if lost in thought. Each sighting added another layer to the mystery surrounding him. Was he planning something? Or was he simply observing, biding his time? What made Chuck's arrival even more intriguing was how little he said, or did at first. Unlike what people expected from a larger-than-life figure, he didn't march into town guns blazing, ready to take down the Iron Vipers single-handedly. Instead, he moved quietly, deliberately, blending into the background while gathering information. He visited Hank in the hospital, sitting by his bedside without uttering a word. Their connection was undeniable. You could see it in the way Hank's eyes lit up when Chuck entered the room. They didn't need to speak. They understood each other perfectly. While most of the town buzzed with excitement about Chuck's return, not everyone was convinced. Skeptics argued that relying on a legend, even one as famous as Chuck Norris, was foolish. After all, the Iron Vipers weren't just a bunch of rowdy bikers. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and armed to the teeth. How could one man, no matter how skilled, possibly stand against them? But skepticism didn't last long. Strange things started happening around town, things that couldn't be easily explained. One night, a group of teenagers hanging out near the edge of the woods swore they saw someone practicing martial arts under the moonlight. The figure moved with incredible speed and precision, delivering blows powerful enough to split tree trunks in half. Another resident reported hearing the distant hum of a helicopter overhead, though no aircraft appeared on radar. And then there were the subtle changes within the community itself. People began acting differently, not out of fear, but out of confidence. Shopkeepers reopened their stores earlier than usual. Parents let their kids play outside again. Even the local sheriff seemed to walk taller, as if inspired by the mere possibility that help had arrived. Behind the scenes, Chuck worked tirelessly. He wasn't interested in fanfare or recognition. His mission was clear: protect the innocent, and send a message to those who thought they could harm them. To do that, he needed to know everything about the Iron Vipers, their routines, their hideouts, their weaknesses. So he went undercover, infiltrating their ranks with ease. Disguised as a drifter looking for work, he gained access to their inner circle. He listened carefully, piecing together fragments of information until he had a complete picture of the gang's operations. Every detail mattered. Chuck learned which members carried weapons, where they stashed their supplies, and how they communicated with each other. He memorized the layout of their clubhouse, noting exits, windows, and potential ambush points. Most importantly, he identified the leaders, the ones calling the shots and instilling fear in everyone else. By the second night, he knew exactly what he had to do. Still, Chuck didn't act immediately. Patience was key. He waited for the perfect moment, letting the Iron Vipers grow complacent. They had no idea they were being watched, no clue that their days of terror were numbered. Meanwhile, back in town, the suspense reached a fever pitch. Everyone wondered when and how Chuck would make his move. Would it be loud and explosive, worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster? Or would it be quiet and calculated, leaving the gang reeling before they even realized what hit them? As the hours ticked by, the townspeople held their breath. They wanted revenge, justice, closure, but above all, they wanted safety. And deep down, they trusted Chuck to deliver it. After all, this wasn't just about protecting a community anymore. It was personal. The Iron Vipers had crossed a line when they attacked Hank, a man who represented everything good and honorable. Now they were about to face the consequences. The rain fell hard that night, drumming against rooftops and turning dirt roads into muddy rivers. The town was quiet, almost eerily so, as if everyone instinctively knew something big was about to happen. Inside their homes, people sat by windows, peeking through curtains, straining to catch a glimpse of anything unusual. But outside, the streets were empty, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the darkness. Meanwhile, deep in the woods on the outskirts of town, Norris moved like a shadow. His cowboy hat was pulled low, shielding his face from the downpour, and his boots barely made a sound as he navigated the slick terrain. He had spent the past 2 days gathering every scrap of information he could about the Iron Vipers, their habits, their weaknesses, their arrogance. Now, armed with that knowledge, he was ready to strike. The gang's clubhouse was a crumbling old building tucked away in the forest, far enough from town to avoid prying eyes, but close enough to remind everyone who was in charge. It wasn't much to look at, just a ramshackle structure with peeling paint and broken windows, but it served its purpose. For the Iron Vipers, it was a fortress, a place where they could drink, fight, and plot without fear of consequences. Tonight, however, that sense of security would prove to be their undoing. Chuck approached the clubhouse cautiously, sticking to the tree line to stay hidden. He watched as lights flickered inside, casting distorted shadows on the walls. The sound of laughter and raucous shouting carried through the storm, mingling with the crackle of thunder. These men weren't expecting trouble. They were too busy celebrating their dominance over the town. To them, Hank's beating was just another notch on their belt, proof that no one dared stand up to them. But Chuck wasn't just anyone. He circled the building slowly, taking note of every detail. 2 bikers stood guard near the front door, huddled under the eaves to escape the rain. Another leaned against a parked motorcycle, smoking a cigarette and staring blankly into the distance. They weren't paying attention, not really. Why would they? In their minds, they were untouchable. Chuck smiled faintly beneath his hat. Arrogance always led to mistakes. Moving with precision, he slipped closer to the first pair of guards. One moment they were laughing about some crude joke. The next they collapsed silently to the ground, unconscious before they even realized what hit them. Chuck didn't waste time. He dragged their bodies out of sight, ensuring they wouldn't be found until it was too late. Then, with the same calm efficiency, he disarmed the third biker and left him slumped beside his bike, snoring softly. Now came the tricky part. Getting inside unnoticed would require finesse. Chuck scanned the perimeter, spotting a side window, slightly ajar. Perfect. He hoisted himself up, careful to avoid making noise, and slid inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat, and the floor creaked faintly under his weight. But the gang members inside were too drunk and distracted to notice. Inside the clubhouse, chaos reigned. Bottles clinked together in drunken toasts. Music blared from a battered stereo, and arguments broke out over card games. Chuck took it all in from the shadows, his sharp eyes cataloging every movement. There were about a dozen men scattered throughout the room, most of them sprawled, across chairs or passed out on couches. At the center of it all sat the leader, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek and an air of authority that even alcohol couldn't dull. He was flanked by his top lieutenants, the ones Chuck had identified during his reconnaissance. For a moment, Chuck simply observed. He needed to understand the dynamics of the group to anticipate how they might react once things went sideways. Timing was everything. One wrong move, and the situation could spiral out of control. But Chuck didn't make mistakes, not when it mattered this much. When he finally decided to act, it was with breathtaking speed. He stepped out of the shadows, his presence commanding immediate attention. For a split second, the room fell silent, the only sound the steady drip of rain leaking through the roof. Then, pandemonium erupted. "What the hell is this?" the leader barked, rising unsteadily to his feet. His hand reached for the knife strapped to his belt, but before he could draw it, Chuck was already moving. With a single fluid motion, Chuck closed the distance between them, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until the weapon clattered, harmlessly, to the floor. Before the leader could recover, a swift kick sent him sprawling backward onto a table, scattering bottles and cards everywhere. The rest of the gang scrambled to respond, reaching for weapons or charging blindly in Chuck's direction. But none of them stood a chance. Chuck fought with a grace and power that seemed almost supernatural. Every punch landed with pinpoint accuracy. Every kick sent opponents sprawling. He dodged attacks effortlessly, using the gang's own momentum against them. Within moments, half the room was on the ground, groaning in pain or unconscious altogether. The others tried to regroup, forming a loose circle around him, but fear began to creep into their eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one was supposed to take them down like this. And yet here he was. As the fight wore on, Chuck's movements became less about brute force and more about sending a message. Each blow carried weight, not just physically, but symbolically. This wasn't just about defeating the Iron Vipers. It was about dismantling their reputation, shattering the illusion of invincibility they had built for themselves. By the time the last biker hit the floor, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. These men were nothing without their bravado. When it was over, Chuck stood alone in the center of the room, breathing steadily despite the intensity of the battle. Around him lay the remnants of the Iron Vipers, moaning and clutching their injuries. Not a single one remained standing. Chuck glanced around once more, then turned his attention to the wall. Pulling a small notepad from his pocket, he scribbled a brief message and pinned it to the wood with a knife. The words were simple, but they said everything that needed to be said. Respect your elders. Without another word, Chuck turned and walked out into the storm, disappearing into the night as quickly and quietly as he had arrived. Behind him, the clubhouse was silent except for the soft patter of rain seeping through the cracks in the ceiling. The Iron Vipers were finished, or at least, their reign of terror was. Back in town, no one knew exactly what had happened yet. But as dawn broke over the horizon, the truth would come to light. And when it did, the legend of Chuck Norris would grow even larger, cementing his place not just as a fighter, but as a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. By the time the sun began to rise, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, the storm had passed. The air smelled fresh, cleansed by the rain, but beneath it lingered an unease that hadn't quite dissipated. In the town, people were restless. They had spent the night wondering what, if anything, had happened out there in the woods. Had Chuck Norris really gone after the Iron Vipers? Or was he just a figment of their collective imagination, a myth conjured up to ease their fears? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. It started with a call to the local sheriff's office. A hunter heading out early to check his traps stumbled upon the Iron Vipers clubhouse. What he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. The front door hung open, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the scene was chaos. Overturned furniture, shattered bottles, and bodies sprawled across the floor like discarded toys. At first glance, it looked like a war zone, but as the hunter stepped closer, he realized something strange. None of the men appeared to be dead. They were alive, though barely. Groaning, clutching various parts of their bodies, they lay where, They had fallen too weak or dazed to move. Panic set in when the hunter noticed the note pinned to the wall. Written in bold, deliberate handwriting were 3 words that sent chills down his spine. Respect your elders. Below it, embedded deeply into the wood, was a knife, a clear sign that whoever had done this wasn't messing around. Shaken, the hunter called the authorities. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire. People poured out of their homes, gathering cautiously near the clubhouse to see for themselves. Some brought blankets to cover the injured. Others simply stood back, staring in disbelief. The Iron Vipers, the same gang that had terrorized the town, beaten a defenseless 90-year-old man, and acted as if they were untouchable, were now lying broken and humiliated on the floor of their own hideout. When the sheriff arrived, he took one look at the carnage and shook his head. This wasn't a fight, he muttered under his breath. This was a statement. As paramedics loaded the bikers onto stretchers and carted them off to the hospital, whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Who could have done this, and how? There were no signs of a struggle outside, no evidence of multiple attackers. Whoever had taken down the Iron Vipers had done so alone, and with terrifying efficiency. Then someone spotted it. Near the edge of the woods, partially hidden by mud and leaves, was a set of tire tracks leading away from the clubhouse. Not car, tires, motorcycle tires. Someone had ridden in, handled business, and disappeared without a trace. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. Chuck Norris, someone whispered. The name hung in the air, heavy with meaning. No one said it outright, not yet. But the implication was clear. This was exactly the kind of thing people imagined Chuck would do. Quiet, precise, and devastatingly effective. He hadn't come to negotiate or issue warnings. He'd come to end the problem once and for all. Back in town, the mood shifted dramatically. For days, fear had gripped the community, holding everyone hostage in their own homes. Now, relief washed over them like a tidal wave. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors and swept away the dust that had accumulated during the Iron Vipers' reign of terror. Parents let their kids play outside again, laughing as they chased each other through the streets. Even the old-timers at the diner seemed livelier, swapping stories about the mysterious stranger who had saved them all. But amidst the celebration, there was also quiet reflection. Hank's attack had been a wake-up call, reminding everyone how fragile peace could be. The Iron Vipers might have been defeated, but what about the next threat? Would they always need someone like Chuck Norris to step in and save the day? Or was there something they could do to protect themselves? For Hank, the answer was simple. Lying in his hospital bed, propped up by pillows, he watched the morning news report about the Iron Vipers' downfall. His face was still bruised, his movements slow and deliberate, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. When a nurse asked if he knew anything about the man responsible for taking down the gang, Hank just smiled faintly. "He's a good friend," was all he said. No matter how much people pressed him for details, Hank refused to elaborate. To him, Chuck wasn't a spectacle or a legend to be gossiped about. He was family, a brother in arms who had shown up when it mattered most. That bond didn't need explaining. As the days turned into weeks, life in the town slowly returned to normal. The Iron Vipers disbanded, their members either arrested or too scared to regroup. Without their leaders to guide them, the rest of the gang scattered like leaves in the wind. The clubhouse, once a symbol of fear, was torn down and replaced with a community garden. It was Hank's idea, a way to reclaim the land and turn something ugly into something beautiful. People often joked that Chuck Norris must have had a hand in that too. After all, wasn't he the one who inspired them to stand up for themselves? Whether or not he'd actually planted any seeds, his influence was undeniable. He had reminded them that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing the right thing even when you were afraid. Still, despite the jokes and the gratitude, no one ever saw Chuck again. He vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind only memories and a renewed sense of hope. Some claimed they spotted him riding his vintage motorcycle along the highway, heading toward the horizon. Others swore they heard his voice in the wind, whispering words of encouragement whenever doubt crept in. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Chuck Norris had made an impact that would last far beyond his departure. He had taught the town a valuable lesson that heroes don't always wear capes or seek glory. Sometimes they ride into town quietly, do what needs to be done, and leave without asking for thanks. And sometimes just knowing they exist is enough to give people the strength to face whatever comes next. In the end, the story of Chuck Norris and the Iron Vipers became more than just a tale of justice served. It was a reminder that kindness, resilience, and bravery can overcome even the darkest of times, and in a world full of uncertainty, that was a message worth holding on to. As weeks turned into months, the town began to heal. The scars left by the Iron Viper's reign of terror were still visible, but they weren't as raw as they once had been. Hank's recovery was slow, but steady. His bruises faded, and though his body ached more than it used to, his spirit remained unbroken. Every day he grew stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. He'd survived something unimaginable, and in doing so he'd become a symbol of resilience for everyone around him. The community rallied behind Hank in ways that surprised even him. Neighbors stopped by regularly, bringing meals, books, and stories to keep him company. Kids from the neighborhood came to visit after school, eager to hear tales of his wartime adventures or ask about Chuck Norris. Was he really as tough as they say? One boy asked during one such visit, wide-eyed with wonder. Hank chuckled softly before replying, "Tougher." But it wasn't just curiosity driving the townsfolk. There was a deep sense of gratitude, a shared understanding that Hank's attack had been a turning point. It had forced them to confront their fears and recognize the strength within themselves. They owed much of that awakening to Chuck Norris, whose quiet intervention had reminded them that heroes exist, even if you don't see them every day. The garden where the Iron Vipers clubhouse once stood became a cornerstone of the town's revival. Hank took charge of its design, insisting on creating a space that reflected hope and renewal. Rows of vibrant flowers flanked winding pathways lined with benches, perfect for sitting and reflecting. In the center stood a small memorial, a plaque dedicated to those who refused to let fear rule their lives. Beneath it, someone had planted sunflowers, their golden heads reaching toward the sky like symbols of defiance against darkness. Every Saturday morning, volunteers gathered to tend to the garden. Some weeded, others watered, and a few painted murals on the surrounding fence depicting scenes of unity and courage. It wasn't uncommon to overhear snippets of conversation about Chuck Norris while they worked. "You think he'll ever come back?" one woman asked as she pruned a rose bush. Her friend shrugged. "Maybe not. But does it matter? He did what he came here to do." These moments of reflection brought the community closer together. What had once been a fractured group of individuals now felt like a family bound by shared experiences. People looked out for each other more, offering help without being asked and standing up when injustice reared its head. The Iron Viper's attack had shaken them, yes, but it had also strengthened their resolve to protect what mattered most. For Hank, the transformation was profound. Before the attack, he'd lived a quiet life, content to stay in the background and share his wisdom only with those who sought it. Now he found himself at the forefront of the town's efforts to rebuild. He spoke at community meetings, encouraged young people to pursue their dreams, and reminded everyone that kindness could be a form of resistance. "You don't have to fight with your fist to make a difference," he often said. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show compassion." His words resonated deeply, especially with the younger generation. Teenagers who had grown up idolizing action heroes began to see value in quieter forms of heroism. They organized fundraisers for local charities, volunteered at the senior center, and started mentoring programs for kids struggling in school. One teenager even started a podcast called Voices of Courage, featuring interviews with residents about how they overcame adversity. When asked why he chose that name, he smiled and said, "Because courage isn't just about taking down bad guys. It's about making the world better, one small act at a time." Of course, not everything changed overnight. Fear has a way of lingering, even after the threat is gone. Some nights, parents checked their doors twice before going to bed. Others avoided certain parts of the woods, convinced the iron vipers might return. But these moments of hesitation didn't define them anymore. Instead, they served as reminders of how far they'd come, and how determined they were to never let fear control them again. Even the sheriff noticed a shift in the town's energy. Crime rates dropped significantly, not because law enforcement cracked down harder, but because people started looking out for each other. If someone saw suspicious activity, they reported it immediately. If a neighbor needed help, they offered it without hesitation. Trust, once shattered, began to rebuild brick by brick. Then there were the stories, the countless tales spun about Chuck Norris that spread beyond the town's borders. Truck drivers passing through swore they saw a lone rider cruising along desolate highways, his cowboy hat silhouetted against the sunset. Travelers claimed to spot him in diners late at night, sipping coffee and staring out the window as if waiting for another mission. And then there were the urban legends, Chuck stopping runaway trains with his bare hands, Chuck rescuing stranded hikers from avalanches, Chuck single-handedly preventing wildfires. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated didn't matter. What mattered was the message they carried, that good will always rise to meet evil, no matter how insurmountable the odds may seem. For the townspeople, Chuck Norris wasn't just a man. He was an idea, a beacon of hope that inspired them to believe in themselves and each other. One crisp autumn afternoon, Hank decided to host a small gathering in the garden. Tables were set up under colorful streamers, and the air smelled of freshly baked pies and roasted corn. It wasn't a grand celebration, just a chance for neighbors to reconnect and appreciate how far they'd come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the flowers, Hank stood up to speak. "I won't lie to you," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "What happened to me shook me to my core. I never thought I'd live to see the day when men could treat someone like me, with no regard for age or decency, and get away with it. But then, something incredible happened. Someone showed us that justice isn't just a word, it's an action, a choice." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd. Chuck Norris didn't just take down the iron vipers, he reminded us of who we are. We're fighters, survivors, people who refuse to let hate win. So today I want to thank him, not just for what he did, but for showing us what we're capable of. The applause that followed was thunderous, filled with cheers and whistles. Tears welled up in some eyes while others simply nodded in agreement. Hank sat back down, exhausted but content, knowing he'd said everything that needed saying. As the evening wore on, laughter and music filled the air. Kids chased fireflies, couples danced under the stars, and older folks swapped jokes over cups of cider. For the first time in a long time, the town felt alive, not just surviving but thriving. And somewhere miles away, a lone rider sped down an open highway, the wind whipping through his hair. His work here was done. Months had passed since the night Chuck Norris disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind a town forever changed. Life in the small community carried on, but the memory of his quiet intervention lingered like a comforting presence. People went about their days with renewed purpose, knowing they'd been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild not just their town but themselves. Hank continued to recover, though he walked a little slower now and leaned heavily on his cane. Still, he refused to let age or injury slow him down completely. Every morning, rain or shine, he visited the garden that had replaced the Iron Vipers clubhouse. He'd sit on one of the benches, sipping coffee from a thermos, watching as the sunflowers swayed gently in the breeze. Sometimes kids would join him, asking questions about the war, about courage, about Chuck Norris. Hank always answered patiently, weaving lessons into his stories. "You know," he said one afternoon, to a group of curious children gathered around him, "a real hero isn't someone who fights all the time. A real hero is someone who stands up when others can't or won't. That's what Chuck did for us. But you know what? We're heroes too. Every day we choose kindness over anger, hope over fear. We're doing what he did. The kids nodded, thoughtfully, soaking in his words like thirsty roots drinking water. To them, Hank wasn't just an old man. He was proof that bravery didn't have an expiration date. And while none of them had seen Chuck Norris firsthand, they felt connected to him through Hank's stories, like he was still out there somewhere, watching over them. The garden became more than just a place to grow flowers. It became a sanctuary. On weekends, families picnicked under the shade of newly planted trees. Artists set up easels to paint the vibrant blooms. Even couples chose it as a spot for proposals, drawn by its symbolism of renewal and resilience. One elderly woman brought her knitting needles and blankets she'd made for charity, selling them to raise funds for local causes. Another man started hosting free yoga classes every Sunday morning, inviting anyone who wanted to stretch both body and mind. Every detail of the space reflected the town's collective effort to move forward. The murals on the fence grew brighter, depicting scenes of unity, hands clasped together, smiling faces and fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Someone added a plaque near the entrance, engraved with simple yet powerful words. Courage grows where love takes root. It wasn't long before travelers passing through began stopping to see the famous garden. Word spread quickly about the town that had risen above fear, about the 90-year-old veteran who inspired them, and about the mysterious figure who had shown up in silence and left without a trace. Tourists snapped photos of the memorial, bought postcards featuring the sunflowers, and left donations to support the upkeep of the space. For many, visiting the garden felt like paying tribute to something greater than themselves, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could break through. But the legacy of Chuck Norris extended far beyond the physical reminders scattered throughout the town. It lived in the way people treated each other. Neighbors checked in on one another more often, making sure no one felt forgotten or alone. Strangers exchanged warm smiles instead of wary glances. When conflicts arose, and they inevitably did, they were resolved with conversation rather than confrontation. The Iron Viper's attack had taught everyone how fragile trust could be, and they weren't about to take it for granted again. Even the younger generation carried the torch of change. Inspired by Hank's example, teenagers organized events aimed at fostering connection within the community. They held movie nights in the park, inviting families to bring blankets and snacks. They cleaned up litter along highways and painted over graffiti on abandoned buildings. One group started a mentoring program, pairing high school students with elementary kids struggling in school or at home. "We're not waiting for trouble to find us anymore," one teen explained during a town meeting. "We're creating something better so trouble doesn't stand a chance." Their enthusiasm was contagious, rekindling a sense of pride in the older residents. Farmers shared tips on sustainable farming practices. Retirees taught workshops on woodworking and sewing. Even the local library saw an increase in visitors, thanks to book clubs and storytelling sessions hosted by volunteers. Slowly but surely, the town transformed into a place where everyone had a role to play, and everyone mattered. Still, there were moments when life tested their newfound strength. A drought threatened crops one summer, forcing farmers to band together and share resources. A house fire displaced a family, prompting neighbors to open their homes and organize fundraisers. Each challenge brought uncertainty, but also opportunities, to prove that the spirit of resilience hadn't faded. Instead, it had grown stronger, rooted in the belief that they were capable of overcoming anything, as long as they stood united. And then, there were the quieter victories. The ones that didn't make headlines but meant everything to those involved. Like the elderly widower who finally agreed to attend a community dinner after months of isolation. Or the shy teenager who found the courage to perform a song at the annual talent show. These moments reminded everyone that heroism wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was simply showing up for someone else when they needed it most. Years later, when outsiders asked about the town's history, locals spoke proudly of the Iron Viper's downfall, not because of the violence, but because of what came afterward. They talked about Hank, whose determination had inspired them to keep going. They talked about the garden, which served as a living testament to their ability to turn pain into beauty. And yes, they talked about Chuck Norris, whose brief appearance had ignited a spark of hope that never dimmed. Some believed he still rode across the country, helping those in need wherever he went. Others thought he might return someday, though no one expected it. Either way, his impact remained undeniable. He had shown them that legends weren't just characters in stories, they were ideas, values, and actions that could shape the world. On clear nights, when the stars stretched endlessly, across the sky people sometimes swore they saw a lone rider cruising along distant highways. Whether it was truly him didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling he left behind, a belief that even in the face of darkness there was always someone willing to step forward and remind the world what it meant to be human. In the end, the story of the Iron Vipers, Hank, and Chuck Norris wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about the power of ordinary people coming together to create something extraordinary. And as long as that spirit endured, the town knew they'd be ready for whatever lay ahead.